Good morning. Welcome to our class together again today. We're continuing our study on the Christ in the shadows of the Old Testament. We're up to the 11th episode so far. Today we're going to focus on something interesting. And it's a kind of a narrowing type of situation, but we're going to the New Testament and we're beginning to look backwards. And that's going to be a different idea for us, I think. But I'd like to start by getting your attention on something that we all have had experience with. When my father was alive, I remember as a kid, he out in the garage, he would have a coffee can. And that coffee can was all kinds of nuts and bolts and screws and nails. And I remember every time he needed to find a screw or a nut or something that was necessary for repair, he'd take that coffee can and he'd dump it out. And as he dumped it out, he uh, he had to start searching through it to find out which one would fit something else. And so if he needed a nut and a bolt, he would have to find the nut that he wanted. Then he'd have to find the bolt that would match it. And that was a constant problem. And it happens to every man, as far as I know. I have the same thing in my workshop. I have a collection of miscellaneous nuts and bolts, and when I need one, I've got to go hunt to find out which one fits the other. Now, the relevance for that is very simple, and that is that we're looking for the right fit today. How do you know that Jesus is the one spoken of in the Old Testament? We need to ask ourselves a couple questions if we're intellectually honest. One is, how do we know it's not just a coincidence? How do we know that somehow things just didn't kind of converge and Jesus kind of fit things, but it wasn't by design and it wasn't fulfillment of prophecy. It just kind of came together in a random pattern. Now for us, we'd go, that just doesn't happen, but that's just us. That's because we believe it. But what if you disassemble your belief and say, what is it? Do we really believe that? Is it a coincidence or is it not? But I think the second question is an important one as well. Are we taking the Old Testament and forcing into it something that's just not there? I know it's really possible to want to see something so badly that you will put it there even if it's not there. Is that what we've done when we've read the Old Testament and said this is about Jesus, or Jesus fulfills this, or Jesus completes the picture of this? Have we taken it and making it say more than it ever should have said, just so it will please us and make our case? I think we need to explore that, and this is a lesson we're going to use to do that. And if we go backward to the very beginning, we have been doing a narrowing down process. You may not have realized it, but everything that we've done in successive weeks narrows the field in a way that says, now, who could possibly fit the picture that's being painted here? For instance, when we started off in Genesis chapter 3, the only requirement was that this person coming was going to be of the seed of the woman. He was going to be a human being. Now, that covers everybody. If you've ever been born on earth, that covers you. Could anybody be the Messiah? Well, when you go farther down, though, and we got to Genesis chapter 49, we realized it couldn't just be any human being. It had to be Jewish. They had to be part of the family of Abraham. And not only that, they had to come from a particular branch of that through the tribe of Judah. And so it narrowed it down again. Now it was going to have to be someone from the Judean tribe who had the blood of Abraham flowing through his veins, who was also a human being. All of those factors begin to constrict things. Then you move a little further, and we came to Deuteronomy chapter 18, and it was going to be a prophet like Moses. He would fulfill the same roles that Moses would, and he had the same measure of authority that Moses would as well. But then you come down the time of David, and it keeps getting narrower and narrower. Now, it is not just somebody who's from the tribe of Judah, it has to be from a particular family in the tribe of Judah, and it was going to be the tribe It was going to be the family of David, and David was the king, and therefore he would be a king after his loins. It would come from him, and he would reign on a kingdom forever. It was a very intense narrowing process. And we saw the same kind of idea and in the Psalms. But then you came to Isaiah. And Isaiah said, not only is this going to be a king, and not only is he going to be from Judah, and not only is he going to be an Israelite, and not only is he going to be a human, he's got to be a servant too. A servant who pays with his life for the faults, on behalf of the faults of the people who have rejected God already. You see how narrow that got? The process we're doing is narrowing and exclusion. The more we narrow, the more we exclude any other possibilities. It can't be just any human being. And it can't be any Jew. And it can't even be any of the lineage of David. It's going to be a particular person. And so when you come to this and we look at the broad frame of this idea, the Old Testament asks, what will the Messiah be like? It's descriptive. It's giving these hints. It's giving these ideas. But the New Testament comes along and asks, who is he? Now they're going to take the picture and say, now let's fit it to what fits the best of the picture that we know of. Who is going to be a human being who has come from the tribe of Judah, from the family of David, who will rule who will be a king, but also be a suffering servant? Who fits the bill? Who is this? And the real question is, how do we know that Jesus is the one? And so today we're going to go to a single New Testament book. I had to limit this in some way because it's just too broad. And this is even pretty broad. But I want to focus on a single book today, and that's the Gospel of Matthew. And the reason is Matthew likes to use the formula, these were written that the prophecy might be fulfilled. And he has that at least 48 times in his gospel. We're not going to look at 48 instances. I've got to have it narrowed down even more because we only have a limited amount of time in this session. And so I decided we're going to focus only on the prophecies, only on the things that we can see in the betrayal, the trial, and the crucifixion of Jesus. That's the only three areas. But that's plenty to prove the point. That's representative sample. That will help us see what we need to see and test whether or not we have it right or not. So let's start with the betrayal of Jesus. We know the story of the betrayal of Jesus. Judas, for some reason, has decided he is going to try to betray Jesus for a sum of money. He makes a bargain with the Jewish leaders for 30 pieces of silver. He is given the 30 pieces of silver, for which he hands over Jesus with a kiss on his cheek. And after that, he feels great remorse and cannot keep the money. He wants to undo it, but it can't be undone. And so instead, he goes and he casts the money onto the floor of the high priest's home, or at least his palace. And he goes out and he hangs himself out of his remorse. That's the story. But it's more than that we want to look at. I want you to think about these things. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 15, it says that Judas went in and he said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. It's a very specific amount. If you're going to have a deal, you better have the right amount there. And so when he finally feels the remorse after Jesus is arrested and he sees what is happening, he wants to undo it. So Matthew goes along and says, and throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departs, and he went out and he hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, it's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it was blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. I find it kind of interesting that the Jewish leaders have no problem taking blood money out of the treasury, but they can't put blood money back in. And so what are you going to do with this money? Well, they decide to go out and buy a field in which potters throw old broken pots. It is a junk yard, if you will. It is what all the pieces of all broken pots are put in, a potter's field. And there, they're going to bury the indigent. It is going to be a pauper's graveyard. And that's the remedy they have. So you have this little scene there. But I want you to think about something. When you go to the book of Zechariah, Zechariah is a book that is laden with messianic prophecy and allusion. It is after the captivity in which people are beginning to turn the eye and says, who is going to be the one to deliver us? Zechariah is the one that tells us about that the king will ride in to the city on the back of a colt that's never been ridden. It is the foreshadowing of what we call Palm Sunday or the triumphal entry. But in the book of Zechariah, there's something else that we need to see in connection with the betrayal of Jesus. Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 to 15, have this interesting little idea that's implanted in there. Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price of which you have priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord, into the house of the Lord to the potter. Now I want you to think about that. Think about the specificity in that statement. The exact amount coinage, 30 pieces of silver. And what was the 30 pieces of silver done? What was it used for? Where did it go? It went to the potter and his field. Just as Matthew has reported centuries before, at least about 450 years before, this was stated without knowing what it was going to be about. It's too specific to think of, it just happened. Well, let's move on to the trial. The trial has many components to it. When Jesus is tried, he is tried before Herod, he's tried before Pilate, he's tried before the high priest. And there are several things that come out of the trial. One is that Jesus is accused by false witnesses who cannot seem to get their story straight. And so when Matthew begins to record about false witnesses, he said, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. In other words, there are some who came and just told a bald-faced lie about what Jesus intended to do and what he has said. Now, where did that come from? You see, when we read that and the narrative is, that just seems to be the flow of history. But if you go backwards to Psalm 35 and verse 11, it says, malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me of things that I do not know. What was one of the problems that was facing the author of Psalm 35? People were lying about him. And in the same way, it comes to pass about Jesus. Jesus also has that same experience spoken of specifically in the Old Testament. But then he's questioned. And when Jesus is questioned, you know what he does. He doesn't answer them. Matthew tells us, so when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. But Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he gave no answer, not even to a single charge. So the governor was greatly amazed. Why was Pilate so amazed? because he had never seen a man accused of a capital crime in which he was going to lose his life that he didn't say something, even if it's, I didn't do it, or they're wrong, or cursed be you, or something. It was just unusual. He had never seen anything like this before. And he was a hardened guy. Pilate was no neophyte. He was no pansy. He had seen hardened men and stared them in the eyes before they'd go to crosses. And not one of them kept quiet, except for Jesus. He gave no answer. You see, when the suffering servant was going to come, according to Isaiah chapter 53, he said that servant would not open his mouth. He would be like a lamb who is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearer is silent. So he opened not his mouth. You see, the suffering servant will not be normal behavior. He will not exhibit the normal behavior. And Jesus didn't either. He was like the suffering servant. He seemed to reflect the same idea of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. But when that happens, and suddenly Jesus is turned over to the guards who use him as a play toy, as something to be mocked. And so Matthew tells us something about the treatment of Jesus. Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him. I'd like you to think just for a moment how very definite, how very concrete that picture really is. They spit at him in the face. They just didn't spit, they spit in his face. When you go back to Isaiah chapter 50, when you start talking about the servant who would come, which is the theme of that section, Isaiah says, I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from the disgrace and the spitting. Again, you have a very specific behavior. You could have always said the derision or the mocking, but there is a very particular thing that's there that happens exactly to Jesus that 600 years before had already been prophesied that would happen. But then he's led out to Calvary, and there he's put on the cross. He's lifted up. It drops into the hole. He begins the fairly quick journey of dying a very painful death. And so Matthew paints the scene. One of the things he says is then two robbers were crucified with him. I always wonder why he added the word robbers. Why didn't he just say criminal? Why didn't he just say two others? Why specify their crime? It's irrelevant, really, isn't it? Why do you care why those two guys are there? They're dying because they're supposed to, because they did something wrong. You can infer that from reading it. And yet he says they were robbers. Now, why? Because of the suffering servant. Therefore, I will divide my portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. He would be placed in the same category as those who had broken the law. Jesus was put in the same situation as robbers. He was numbered with the transgressors. It's one of those little things that hooks itself to the story of Jesus. But then the behavior of the crowds is mentioned. Suddenly, Matthew turns his attention from what is happening around the cross to what's happening at the base of the cross. Now he's talking about the crowds and how they're reacting. It says, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. Again, why does he say that he didn't have to say wagging their heads. Deriding him would have been enough. But he adds the specific behavior that is taking place. Why? Could it be that he harkens back to Psalm 109, where he says, I am the object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they wag their heads. He describes it with detail because that is what the detail was said to have included. Long before, this is what was going to take place. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. But then as Jesus approaches death, he's in pain. And so to dull the pain, the soldiers know what to do. They put a sponge to his mouth that they've soaked in sour wine, and which was gall and vinegar. And they put it to his lips, and it tastes bad, but you take it in because it will act as a sedative. So they give him this. Matthew says, and they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, that sour wine with the vinegar. And that's the gall, vinegar. Why mention that? Yes, I know it's part of the narrative. Yes, you tell the story, and that's what happened. But does it have some other reason? Why does he just say they gave him something to drink? Why give you the mixture? Because when you go to Psalm 69, it says, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink. Jesus fits a pattern somewhere. What's happening to him is what was spoken of before. It's hard to miss it. And it's really hard to miss it for a simple reason. The Jews at the time of Psalm 69 being written had no experience with crucifixion. It was still in the distance to be even created as an execution form. They didn't know anything about it. They stoned to death. And yet here they're describing one of the processes that years later would take place at, at a crucifixion event. Something that the author of Psalm 69 doesn't even know anything about. How can he say something like that? And then later on, the event happens, even though he didn't know anything about it. And then finally comes the end. Jesus hangs on the cross and he says the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is there alone to die. God must turn his back on his son. He must let him die on his own, or it would not be the sacrifice that was needed. And so he cries to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet those words are not spoken of by many. In fact, by any that we can read of. There is no secular version of crucifixion, and there are plenty of them, that mention this being a typical cry of someone dying. Instead, it comes from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Does that not describe how Jesus is feeling? Here I am dying by myself for the sins of the world, and God just has to watch and can't do anything about it. Oh, why have I been forsaken? But one last thing, and that was what was taking place around the cross in the heavens. It tells us in Matthew chapter 27, verse 44, 45, from the sixth hour, there was darkness over all the land until the ninth hour. Gives you a timetable, doesn't it? The Jewish day began at 6 in the morning at sunrise, so the sixth hour of the day would have been noon. And the darkness lasted for 3 full hours. If you've ever seen a solar eclipse, it only lasts for a few seconds, not 3 hours. Something was taking place here that could not be explained in any other way, except when you hearken back to Amos, that 8th century prophet, where he talks about what the day of the Lord will look like. And Amos chapter 8 and verse 9 says, "And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." I want you to think about how specific that one is. The very time matches 6 hours when the darkness took place. It was noon, exactly as Amos said. How could that be? And the last thing that we're going to look at today is the burial of Jesus. You remember what happened? Jesus dies on the cross, and because it is the eve of Passover, the Jews want to get that body buried as fast as they can because it was against their law to leave a body hanging over the Passover Sabbath. And so a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, apparently a secret follower of Jesus, who was very wealthy, is what Matthew says, takes the body and buries it in his own grave. Listen to how Matthew describes this. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. He's a rich man. He tells you exactly who he is. The rich part is important because it points to something else. Is Jesus the suffering servant of Isaiah 53? He says, "And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence." An innocent man dies along with the robbers, but in his death, he is contacted by the rich man that we know as Joseph. A lot of pieces here. So, what does all this mean? I think we need to ask that question. Sometimes we accept all of what we've just talked about. And I'm glad we do, but you can't accept it if you don't understand why you have to accept it. Why is it true? Why is it actual? Why do we accept that this is the picture of the Messiah fulfilled in Jesus himself? A couple of tests I think we need to ask ourselves. The first is, was there a human hand involved? There are some people who, because they want to ignore what the real ramifications are, says the story is this, that Jesus and or his disciples worked the circumstances together so that he would fit the bill. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Neither Jesus nor his disciples created the events to line up with what happened. They couldn't have. See, the problem is they were working out, these events were taking place. They had the control of someone else besides them. You had the high priest and his minions who didn't care a whit about Jesus and his followers and wished they would go away. And then you had Pilate, the Roman, who is in charge of a vast, powerful garrison, who is going to fulfill his duty to Rome and Rome only. And he couldn't have been complicit with this. You can't find a human hand in this. There's no one there creating a scripted way of this is going to take place. At least on earth, you don't. So that's an impossibility, just on the face of it. But the second one, is it a coincidence? Do the things just kind of fall into place and it just happened to be that Jesus puts that together? And it's just a spiritual serendipity that we couldn't have predicted, and everybody just has to kind of accept that it was an interesting little coincidence. Now, let me point out to something. We talked about 11 different things in this lesson. There are 48 in the whole Gospel of Matthew, and there are 345 in the New Testament. We looked at 11 today. Now, a person, a single individual, might fit one of them. For instance, they might be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. Or a person might be crucified in the first century with robbers. They would fit one, maybe two, if you're really lucky, if you're very fortunate. I want you to pay attention to something. In all 11 that we looked at today, he fits every one of those. We only looked at 11. So how can you call it a coincidence if all of these things line up exactly the way they say? Now I know skeptics will say, well, you made them fit. I didn't make anything fit. All I did was read the passages. You could see it for yourselves. So what are the odds that Jesus fits all of these things so well? If it's not a coincidence and it's not a conspiracy, what is it? What are the odds? Let's look at various typical human events. Well, what are the odds of you having a car wreck? Well, they calculate the regular person in America, the odds of him having a car wreck are pretty good. One in 4,292 instances. And so if you get out on the roadway 4,300 times, you're probably going to have a wreck. Makes sense. Most people, sometime in their life, have a wreck. It tends to be a typical occurrence. The probabilities are low. But what about getting caught in a tornado? Now, we're in spring right now as I record this. And in spring, it seems like every other day, the weatherman is crying, tornado warning, take cover. And I can't tell you how many times we have crawled into a crowded closet only to come out of it again with everything intact. Thank goodness. But what are the odds of you getting caught in a tornado? You know what the answer is? It's 1 in over 5 million. You have a very small chance, regardless of what the weatherman says, about getting struck by a tornado. But what about another weather event? It's getting struck by lightning. Now, this is one you probably ought to pay attention to. The weatherman says you need to come in, there's a lightning storm there. That's probably one to heed because you have a 1 in 15,000 chance of getting struck by lightning at least once. And so you stay indoors. You don't go to the golf course. You don't hide under a tree. You don't get into a bathtub. You don't do that stuff because your odds of getting struck by lightning are pretty good. So you've got these all these odds. You can have a good chance that this is a coincidence, or a long shot that Jesus is a coincidence. So which is it? So what are the odds that Jesus matches the 48 prophecies recorded in Matthew? You'll be astounded at the number. Of the 48 in Matthew, I don't even know how to pronounce this number, but it is one with 17 zeros after it. One in that number is the chance that Jesus fulfills all 48 statements attributed to the Old Testament about the Messiah in Matthew. What are the odds he's not? Not real good. That's the biggest long shot in history. And if you took the rest of the New Testament of the 345, it's even worse. It's one out of one with 145 zeros behind it, meaning it's impossible. That's the practical point. It's impossible to say that Jesus was not this because the odds of him not being it are so astronomical that they're infinitesimal. But we don't do well with big numbers. I know that. I don't do it with big numbers. How do you conceive of one out of one with 17 zeros behind it? Let me give you a visual. Say you have a silver dollar. You take this silver dollar and you take a red Sharpie and then you draw a circle on it. And then you cover the surface area of the state of Texas with silver dollars and you put it in there, but you make sure that this coverage of the state of Texas surface area is silver dollars to 2 feet deep. And somewhere in there is a single silver dollar with a red circle on it. And so you find a blind man who cannot see a thing. You bring him in, you stirred the pot, you got all of them, they're all random order. You don't know where it is, you lost it. And you tell the blind man, I want you to go find the silver dollar with the red circle on it. He can't even see it. The odds of Jesus not being the Messiah is the same as that blind man wading into those 2 foot deep of silver dollars in the state of Texas and finding exactly the right one the first time. What's the likelihood? I wouldn't make a bet on that one, I tell you that much. Because you'll lose. Because it won't happen. It's impossible. And what that basically means is it's really impossible that Jesus does not fit this bill. Is Jesus the Messiah? Is that the truth of this? Well, understand that there is no other answer that makes sense in the view of the evidence. Now, you can dismiss the Bible. You can dismiss prophecy. You can just say all of this is hokum, but then you have to prove your premise at the same time. This is just what is presented here. What this means is this very simple idea. The reasonable person has no choice but to believe it. But the resistant person has no choice but to reject it. See, he gives you every opportunity to believe that he's the Messiah. God presents us in such a way with enough specifics, with enough detail, with enough pieces to where a reasonable man would go, he's got to be. I don't see any other way. But the resistant man will take that same evidence and say, I don't want to believe it, so I can't. That's really the only choices you have. So the question for you and I is, are we a reasonable person to believe the evidence that Jesus fulfills what the Old Testament has written? Next week, we're going to continue our study. We're going to look at the preaching in the book of Acts. How did they prove with the Old Testament that Jesus was who he said he was? And they use it a lot of places and a lot of different people. So we're going to look at that next week. Hope you've enjoyed our lesson together as much as I have, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again next Sunday.